So they're asking us to find the average velocity function, and we got the velocity function, which is 4 pi sine t plus 1. So to find the average velocity, we use that formula that we got last week. Remember, this is from the closed interval 0 to pi. That was given in the beginning of the problem. So this will be 1 over b minus a, the integral from a to b of this function. So 4 pi sine t plus 1, and all of that is times dt. Don't forget that differential. Alright, so if we integrate this, we have 1 over pi, and the integral of this part would be negative 4 pi cosine of t, and then the integral of the plus 1 is just plus t, and that's all going to be evaluated from 0 to pi. Alright, so now let's see, we could go ahead and simplify this. Well, we'll just leave it with the 1 over pi out in front. Let's look at 0 and pi. So that's 1, 0, and that's negative 1, 0. Remember, that's always cosine comma sine. So cosine of pi is negative 1. So this will be minus 4 pi times negative 1. And then this is just plus pi. And then minus, plug in the 0. Cosine of 0 is 1, so this would be minus 4 pi times 1, and then plus 0, which is just minus 4 pi. Okay, so now when we multiply here, let's see, here we're going to have what does that come out to? Minus plus 4 pi plus pi is 5 pi. So it's going to be 1 over pi times, this is 5 pi, and then this is plus 4 pi. So that's 9 pi over pi, which just becomes 9. Okay, next one, 90.4. It says the velocity function for a particle moving along the x-axis is given by the velocity is equal to 2 pi cosine of pi t. For what values of t from 0 to 2 is the particle stationary? Well, when it's stationary, that means that the velocity is equal to 0. So 2 pi is never 0, so it's only going to be when cosine of pi t is equal to 0. And where would that be? Here it was 1, here it's negative 1, so it's got to be here and here. So then we can just take pi t is equal to pi over 2, because that's where the cosine is 0. And then pi t is equal to, here would be 3 pi over t. And so up here we get, and it would keep going until we would get to, let's see, up here would be 1 pi plus pi over 2, which would be 5 pi over 2. And then if we went more, it would be 7 pi over 2, but that's bigger than the interval from 0 to 2. Actually, this is bigger than the interval from 0 to 2 also. So we're not going to have to worry about that. We solve this for t. The pi's will cancel, we get 1/2. Here we get, the pi's cancel, we get 3 halves. Here we would get 5 halves, but that proves to you right there that it's too big, so we'll throw that out. So the only values where the particle would be stationary, or the velocity would be equal to 0, would be at t equals 1/2 and t equals 3 halves. All right, one last example. Page 464, 90.5 says, what is the total distance, remember, total distance, traveled to the left by the particle in example 90.4 between the times t equals 0 and t equals 2. All right, so if we look at the graph on page 464, and let's see, that was, which one was that? Example 90.4, the last one that we did. If you graph that, the graph is pictured here on page 464 so that you can see that this point right here is 1/2 and this point was 3 halves. That's where it became 0. So it's asking us where it moves to the left. Well, remember, when it's negative is when it moves to the left. So we're going to integrate from 1/2 to 3 halves, because that's the only part in this time equals 0 to time equals 2 that's negative. So we're going to integrate from 1/2 to 3 halves. And we can pull that 2, let's see, the equation was, what was it? 90 point, it was 2 pi cosine of pi t. All right, so we can pull the 2 out in front, it's just a constant. And then we have cosine of pi t, and then I'm going to leave that extra pi in there, dt. Anybody have any idea why we'd want to leave that pi in there? Because remember, this is not just cosine of x. So you can mentally say u is equal to pi t, and du is going to be equal to pi dt. Well, it's right here. Okay, so we don't have to multiply or divide by anything. So then, what is the integral of cosine? It is sine. So sine of pi t, oops, sorry. And then that's going to be evaluated from 1/2 to 3 halves. Okay, so that would be 2 times the sine of 3 pi over 2, and then minus the sine of pi over 2. And so that's going to be 2 times, let's see, look at this, sine of 3 pi over 2, that's down here, so that's 0, -1, so that would be a -1, minus the sine of pi over 2 is a +1. So then we get 2 times -2, which is -4. So that means it moves 4 units to the left between time is 1/2 and time